Welcome, I'm Suzanne Phillips. Thanks for joining me again on Psych Live. Whether you are someone who loves city living or would love the chance to live in nature on a farm overlooking fields, you're going to be intrigued, I think, and impressed by our guest, Tamara Dean, and her story of relocation to the driftless area of Wisconsin. Drawing upon her new book, Shelter and Storm, At Home in the Driftless, Tamara shares the pain and power of nature in a way most of us have never imagined or experienced. Tamara, your book is actually a series of powerful essays, and your experience of moving with your partner David to the Driftless area of Wisconsin is quite impressive. Now, I want to go back just and say that Tamara is a writer whose essays and stories have been published in the American Scholar, the Georgia Review, the Guardian, One Story, Orion, and The Progressive. She's the author of an earlier book, The Human-Powered Home, Choosing Muscles Over Motors. Tamara has been camping, fishing, hiking, and gathering food from an early age, led by parents who grew up on farms in Wisconsin. And then she had the opportunity to move to a small city and go to college. As described by a farming neighbor, her parents had the chance to step away from farming to give her broader opportunities, which she brings back to the farm. Her understanding and love of nature is a part of who she is. Tamara Dean, it's my privilege to welcome you to Psych Up Live.
It's so wonderful to be on, Sue, and thank you for that warm, wonderful introduction.
Okay, so tell us what and where the Driftless is so we have a sense of location.
Yeah, a lot of people haven't heard of the Driftless area, but it's mainly the southwestern corner of Wisconsin, and it covers 8,500 square miles there. It's called Driftless because the drift, which is the sand and silt and pebbles and boulders that glaciers pushed ahead of them and then left behind as they receded, does not exist there because this area never experienced any of North America's glaciers, and that might be up to 2 dozen of them. It's remarkable. It's certainly not the only unglaciated area on the planet, but it's remarkable because it's this little island that the glaciers missed. And so it's characterized by an entirely different topography than most of the flat Midwest. It's got steep limestone bluffs and narrow river valleys with beautiful spring-fed streams. People around here know it as a wonderful place to go trout fishing or paddling and any kind of other recreation, including star watching. And then because of the narrow river valleys, it's a different kind of agriculture that's practiced in that area. You don't get the giant flat fields that you'll see in
Mm,
Illinois or Iowa. So you can't have such big ag dominating the landscape. Instead, there are more small family farms and also more organic farms. And that led to the rise and the creation of Organic Valley, which is the world's largest cooperative of organic growers. And that was headquartered just up the road from where we lived out there.
mm.
But David and I were looking for a place to start over as we sought a healthier life and also wanted to live out our environmental principles. And when we got to the Driftless area, which was only about 2 hours from where we were living at the time in Madison, we fell in love with the landscape. It's just enchanting and magical, and a lot of people do get seduced by it.
Okay, so now when you and David made the decision to buy the piece that you fell in love with, was that in conjunction with you giving up your office jobs, or did you work remotely? What changed, or did you have to give up those jobs?
I was able to work remotely. I mainly earned my living as a textbook writer at the time. I had had an early career in IT or, computer networking, and I wrote textbooks for college students on computer networking, so I could take my job anywhere. David, however, stepped down from his IT consulting job just to, establish our life in the country.
Mm. Now, one thing I always found so interesting is you write, we weren't young when we made the decision to live in the driftless, but we were younger than the average American farmer who was 55 in 2004. So do you get the sense people start, they're born into a farm family, they start, they stay, and you just never give up? You don't, unless you walk away, you remain a farmer. Do I have that right?
Well, it's changed over the years. I think that used to be the typical narrative in the 20th century, but more and more people are leaving farms. The whole constitution of farms has changed. So in 2004, when we bought that property in the Driftless area, the average age, as you say, of the farmer was 55, but now it's increased even more because the
Mm.
younger generation doesn't want to go into farming or can't find the means to farm in the way that they would like. So farms have been increasingly consolidated in the US. There are fewer farms, but more of them are of a giant size, and more are owned by these conglomerates. There are fewer family farms.
Now, you and David were pretty determined, but pretty soon into buying the land, you learned about um, what you call the blowdown. And your description, or as you say, one forester said it was about as bad as it gets. Tell us what this was, because this might give another couple pause when you hear what this actually was.
The tornado that came through in 2005, just about 11 days before Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana, Mississippi, and that area, was our first literal storm after buying the property. And the title of the book, Shelter and Storm, reflects both the material and the themes of the book. So, anyway, this was our first storm. And it was astonishing to witness the power of nature. We had built a yurt in a field where we were spending some of our time as we worked on other projects on the property. And that tornado decimated the yurt in an instant. The wood stove was found, hundreds of yards away. So this was immense power. And then it, as you indicated, it just decimated 40 acres of woods on our property. It was hard to see that this forest that we recognize and prefer as vertical was now horizontal. It's
Mm.
hard to navigate. It's hard to see landmarks. And I could tell that the animals were also having a hard time navigating because there was so much noise in the underbrush. And
Mm.
then came the decision what to do with this. People would drive by and stop and say, well, I could log that for you. But we knew that logging is a messy and, impactful operation. It's not gentle on the land. So anything in its path is going to get crushed. At the same time, we could use some money from this timber that would have been worth a lot had it still been standing, and we could salvage some of it for the mill. Also, there were highly erodible areas where logging would have damaged it beyond repair. So memorably, I was just fraught with indecision. And a friend of mine who's a Buddhist monk said to me, "Can you do nothing?" And I thought, huh. Um, but you want to fix the situation. That's our human
Mm.
impulse. In the end, we chose a middle path, which was we allowed loggers in to take the most accessible logs that were the least damaged and leave the rest. And indeed, after a few years, the forest grew up around it, and you
Mm.
can almost not tell where it is. Mhm.
I love this one line you said. One of the foresters said, as pointing to the tree, "Oh, look what happened to this guy." It's so clear that when you are working and living in nature, it becomes so personal. It was very touching to read that because I thought, well, this man's really experiencing the pain of like having lost a friend in this tree. And I see that you and David also sort of really connected in a very personal way to nature all along. Now, one of the things that you say, one comedian writes, is that the only topic that's off limits for comedians is cancer. And that becomes part of your story early on. Tamara, is that right?
It's
And
right. When we were in the middle of building our home, which we made out of compressed earth blocks, out of our own clay subsoil and some sand dredged from the Mississippi River, which was free for the hauling because they're always dredging that river to make those shipping lanes clear, and a little bit of Portland cement. That was our recipe for the bricks. Anyway, we were trying to live this healthier life, and what comes along but cancer? And it stopped everything in our construction. At the time, David and I had been so um, engrossed in our construction project, and we had come to arguments occasionally, which we normally would never do. But people say if you want to keep your relationship solid, you shouldn't like wallpaper. Well, this was like
It's true.
wallpapering every day. I mean,
Yes,
you
it's
know,
true. It's
nothing would
very,
stay the same, dimensions and budget and timelines. So the cancer came along and stopped everything for a while. It was not, the worst case, and I was able to get through it. But it certainly made us think about what we were doing out there.
it really speaks to your bond too, because you go from, as you say, 20 days in which you made 7,220 blocks or bricks for your future home, arguing about the compost cellar. Um, and I love this one line. You say a couple can't build a house together if they actually want to live together in that house. But you guys managed it, and you did step back to take care of you. Um, in a really very special way. This I mentioned before the show. David is such an interesting figure in the movie here because he's able to do everything. At one point in your story, a neighbor um, shows up very upset, an older man. It turns out he is having some medical problems, and he's beside himself that the beavers have created a dam. His land is flooding. Now, my husband's an engineer, and the mascot of every engineering school is the beaver. So when I read that David takes on this engineering feat, I say to my husband, "You have got to hear this. Tell me what you think about this." And he says, "This is very impressive. Look at what this guy did." I said, "I know, but he's able to do everything, and so is she." This is really quite a couple. So, David, in your relationship, is someone very similar, comes from a similar background to you, Tamara? Does he come from sort of farming and able to sort of, in his own way, figure out engineering obstacles?
Well, we are very similar in so many ways. We're both tinkerers. We're both detail oriented. We're both analytical and logical. His family weren't farmers, but they were engineers. And
Okay.
he and I both started our college careers in engineering and then
Okay.
switched to communications, and in his case, broadcasting, in my case, telecommunications. So
Okay.
we have very similar backgrounds. But yes, he is remarkable in that he can look at something and figure out how it works and create a better version or make a replica. And sometimes I would joke to him that I just go around our property breaking things and he follows right behind fixing them. I
It's
mean, I
true.
would break the tractor, and he when I told him that, he said, "Yeah, I love that." So he's very much a fixer.
Yeah, you're quite a good couple in that. But he comes up with this device. I want our listeners to know that continually drains this area, but masks the sounds of running water, which is what the beavers would think would mean they have to expand their dams. Um, and it works. Of course, you realize, and here's the other human interest part of your whole life out there is the bond with neighbors is incredible. I'm so struck with at some point you get a grant to develop a pollinated prairie, but that means, tell me if I'm right, you have to burn a prairie to prepare it. For a pollinated prairie is one that would have bees and birds and what butterflies, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. I had been agonizing over what to do with our property, which used to be a farm, and I had intended to make it a farm again, but I wanted to do diverse organic vegetable growing. That wasn't practical. I soon figured out by doing some back of the envelope calculations and also by becoming wise to the whole economics around agriculture in this country, which supports growers of commodity crops like corn and soybeans and wheat, but doesn't provide much support for organic vegetable growers. So when the Obama administration in 2014 announced that it was offering grants to people with land who wanted to turn old cropland into prairie pollinator habitat, I leapt at the chance because, the pollinators are necessary for growing our crops. Our whole food system would decline or fall apart if it weren't for these bees and butterflies. Yes, we ended up burning several acres on our ridgetop, which used to be a hayfield. On our fourth burn, we invited all these experts and neighbors to help out because we had had one prior to that that almost got out of control when David and I did it ourselves. After the burn, everybody said, "Oh, this was a perfect burn." And I waited up on that ridgetop for an hour just to make sure there were no errant sparks. And then I came back. David went up to the ridgetop an hour later to retrieve some equipment, and he called me on his cell phone and he said, "I'm not panicking." But the fire, later I found out
It's
he
called
was.
denial. That's
Yes,
called
total
denial.
denial.
Yeah, yeah.
I said, I am. He said, the fire has gone all the way to the woods. It's gone to the north as far as our neighbor's property. And he wanted me to come up and help him. And I called some neighbors who had fire extinguishing equipment and also had helped us earlier with the burn. I said, "Can I borrow that equipment again?" And they said, "Okay, yes, of course, you can borrow the equipment, but we're going to help you. We had plans for this evening, but this is our plan now." And they came by and we did put out the fire. This is an example not only of neighbors helping neighbors, which we saw so many times
Mm.
in the country. It was so heartening. And no one ever asked us our politics or who we voted for. It's also comes from a practical reason, which is, the emergency services can't arrive as quickly as they can in an urban area. And in the case of that particular prairie fire, you have to drive through a river to get to that ridge top. The
Wow.
fire trucks would not have done that. So
Mm.
our only option was to put it out ourselves with the help of neighbors. And there were so many instances, as I said. One time we came back from vacation and our cistern, which captured rainwater from our roof and was our only domestic water source, had mysteriously drained while we were away. And without thinking, the guy who ran a syrup operation loaned us his sap truck and his employees and took it down to the fire station where they filled it with water. And when I asked them, "What do I owe you?" they said, "We didn't turn on the meter." And when I offered payment to the guy with the sap truck, he said, "No, don't bother." They refilled our cisterns so that we would have water again. And again, never asked us anything. They probably knew that we had differing political opinions from
Mm.
what theirs were, but it never came up.
Well, the bond is with the love of land, the willingness to risk to keep the land, fertile, safe, to keep the product, the products, if they were making them as farmers, or even the wildlife. So there's this bond that everyone has, regardless of whatever their nationality, as you say, religion or political, belief system is. That's what comes across so powerfully. It's like it's a big piece of every chapter when you see it. I love the experience. I love what you use for the topic community response and collective resilience. Now, I do a lot of outreach work. I'm for the American Group Psychotherapy Association. So whether it's the fires in LA or whether it's Hurricane Katrina, one of the things you did was exactly what we want people to do. At some point, you decide that you're going to maybe tell us about this group, Stories from the Flood, because it's such a good example of what people need to do after, natural disasters and disasters in general.
Yeah, thanks. Stories from the Flood came about from my and my friends' desire to do more for our neighbors after this catastrophic flood that happened in late August of 2018. We had been having chronic record-breaking floods for many years in the Driftless region. By the time we had spent, I don't know, 10 years there, we'd gone through 7 floods.
Mm.
But this flood of 2018 was called a thousand-year flood by the people who had lived there for many years. And it had devastated, homes and barns and livestock, people's ways of life. Luckily, no lives were lost in that particular flood, but it caused trauma for many people. So my friends and I conceived this project called Stories from the Flood. We knew from the research that people recasting their experiences, traumatic experiences, as stories helped them heal because they
Right.
can regard themselves as empowered and strong, which is the truth. But making that narrative out of it really helps them move forward or, deal with the emotions that are still swirling around. So we set out a goal to not interview, but collect stories from over 100 survivors of that catastrophic flood. And indeed, although I'm not a counselor, I don't have a background in psychology. Basically, what I did was sit and ask people questions and listen and recorded their stories. These stories became part of an oral history archive. They
Nice.
were also transcribed and indexed and coded. And these excerpts from the transcripts were published in a booklet that we shared with all
Oh,
survivors.
nice.
Yeah, and they enjoyed seeing their stories together, and we created a celebration of resilience where people shared their stories aloud. And we also invited the aides from, policymakers, elected officials, offices, and they came up to me afterwards and said, we had no idea how much mental health resource is needed in these areas.
Mhm.
We're lacking that. And finally, those transcripts, were gleaned for insights about future flood resilience planning. And
Wow,
these
great.
insights are actually still being used at planning meetings by policymakers or municipal planners or local watershed groups. So it's an example of how personal stories and culture can influence practical planning in the face of climate change. Our other goal from this project was to create a replicable model that we could share with other communities who are facing climate change disasters. We didn't get that far, but it's all out there. The plan and the project is out there for people to copy if they'd like.
Well, it makes so much sense. It's such a beautiful example of what we call narrating healing. It is in the telling or the writing that one has the ability to bear witness to it. But the fact that there's a listener, and then you made it so that there's not only listeners, there's readers, then my catastrophe maybe can help someone else. So I've already lessened the horror of it. I've already lessened my feeling of not being okay because I just had such a terrible thing happen. So your research was wonderful. When I read it, I said, oh, they got this. This is terrific. And the idea that the politicians want to pass it forward is a wonderful thing. We're going to need to take a break. You've been listening to Psych Up Live. We're here with Tamara Dean, and she's the author of a fascinating new book we've been discussing, Shelter and Storm at Home in the Driftless. She's bringing us up close and personal to the wonders, challenges, illness, and community bonds of living in the Driftless of Wisconsin. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're here with author Tamara Dean. She's sharing fascinating stories from her new book, Shelter and Storm at Home in the Driftless. And we were just speaking about the fact that someone said, you never finish these houses, these wonderful houses you dream of and that you start to build together. So, Tamara, do you think you finished it? Did you leave some things unfinished?
We finished it to our satisfaction over many years. People had warned us, if you don't finish the windows right now before you move in, you'll never do it. So we were determined not to be that example. And while we didn't have a door on the bathroom for a few years, we eventually put one there. And we didn't have our finished kitchen until I think we had been there 6 or 7 years.
Okay.
But we did eventually get that in. And, it's easy to accept shortcomings or flaws in the house and to get used to them. But we were committed to finishing the project. That felt important to us, yes.
Now, you say, and this house must have been beautiful, people could see it from the road. And then actually, some brave people actually drove up to see if you would let them see it on the inside. Is that right?
It's true. And I'll tell you something else. Before we finally moved in, people would just walk in and help themselves to a tour. And in the country, one thing we had to get used to was after we moved in, people would open the door and walk in anyway. They'd do that quick knock and then just open the door, even if they didn't know you. Um, so I got used to, locking the door if I had to take a nap or something.
Right.
But yeah, we gave lots of tours because it was so unique. We had this, compressed earth block wall with lime plaster, which looked a little bit like the adobe of the Southwest. And then
Okay.
we had a timber frame structure, and the timbers were made out of old timbers from a J.I. Case warehouse outside of Racine, Wisconsin, that a timber right had reclaimed. We had this beautiful edifice of a stone fireplace in the
Mhm.
center of the room, and we had the clerestory windows above to take more advantage of the sun, so it had passive solar as well. Yeah, we
Wow.
did give a lot of tours.
Yes, yes. So then one day someone says, would you ever be interested in selling?
That surprised me. I hadn't heard that question before. And then our answer, which was unanimous between David and me, was we might consider it someday. It was almost as if we had created this thing, we had had our experience, we had made our mark on the land, but had also left something beautiful for other people to enjoy. And we were enjoying it for the time, but we also in the process of building and living on the land, recognized impermanence, from illness to the deaths of neighbors to other things we encountered along the way. We thought, we've done this for now, but someday we might move on.
What's wonderful and interesting is you both, right throughout the stories, you're often of the same mind, you and David. There's a real compatibility to the way you think, the way you work. It's very precious. Now, one of the things we were talking about at the break is the historical roots of your property. And I'm not sure I'm going to say it right, but I think you come across old tombstones. Tell us a little bit about the historical piece and why you thought it was important to put in the book.
Yes, I wasn't a great student of history when I was young, and the textbooks talked about this battle in this year between this general, and it never stuck with me. But when we got to the property in southwestern Wisconsin, I saw history through the lens of landscape. So I saw the crooked branch in an old maple tree that somebody told me, oh, that's pointing to a spring down below. It's a marker left by somebody who had been on the land so many hundreds of years ago.
Wow.
Other ways that history made it known to me were, the channels that a previous farmer had dug in the field to drain it, one of our low-lying fields. And it enacted or acted on me, that I felt history's presence when I walked through that field. And every time in that place where the drain tile was underneath. I knew because I'd get my feet soaked or the tractor
Oh,
would get
so
stuck.
interesting. Yes.
And then for many years, our neighbors had told us about the small cemetery on our property. We had found the three headstones for little children who had died in the mid 1800s, but our neighbors said, oh, there are also Civil War soldiers buried there, but their tombstones were washed downstream in the epic flood of 1978. So I was on the property for at least 10, 12 years before I finally went to the County Historical Society and said, can you help me understand who's really in that cemetery? And the curator came back with a list that didn't include any men, so there were no Civil War
Mm,
soldiers there. That was just local legend. But it did include a few women of childbearing age, and one read her name aloud, Nancy Ann Harris, as I sat there at the Historical Society. And a woman who sat next to me doing her own genealogical research piped up and said, oh, she was my husband's great 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 aunt. And I said,
whoa.
how do you know that? And then she said, and she died after her 10th abortion. I said, how do you know that? She said, well, it's in the public record. And indeed,
Mm,
her death record, unlike any other record I found in the volumes at the Register of Deeds office, had this notation going up the side of the margin to point out that this had happened probably as a result of her 10th abortion.
mm,
And I thought, I just want to understand this woman's life. And by the way, after the genealogical researcher had made this comment in the Historical Society, another woman who was, eavesdropping on us said, well, that Nancy must have been something else. And I thought, but let's understand her story. And it set me on this long journey of research and trying to create a plausible life for her and really to answer that local legend, which had given the valor and value to these fictitious Civil War soldiers,
mm,
when in fact there were two women of childbearing age who had both died of puerperal peritonitis, which is a consequence after either abortion, miscarriage, or birth.
mm,
And they had not gotten that same recognition.
hmm. And probably had no options, absolutely no other options. Yeah. It's really powerful in a way. It speaks to women's options. It speaks to people being critical of them when they're reality, when they're health-based, and it meant that other babies were left when this poor woman died. Yeah,
Exactly.
her other children. Mm.
Mhm.
Now, one of the other things that, as I said at the break, I jumped at was unfortunately that you describe, and we have it here, as I mentioned, on Long Island, a tremendous problem with Lyme's disease. Tick bearing, deer are always in our yard, and you became quite ill with this. Was it something that almost made you think you couldn't continue on the land, or tell us a little bit about your experience with Lyme's disease?
Yes, I had Lyme disease several times. I mean, at least three times clinically, but it felt like it went on forever. The
Mm,
first case, I probably didn't notice until I'd been dealing with it for 9 months, but suddenly one day I couldn't walk. And
mm.
so that brought me to the doctor. By the way, we had a wonderful doctor who was literate in all these tick-borne illnesses, and
Oh,
he called
great.
our area of the Midwest or area of Wisconsin the epicenter of tick-borne illnesses
Wow.
in the Midwest. So there was care and understanding out there for tick-borne illnesses, but Lyme disease flattened me, and I imagine a lot of your listeners have experienced
Mm.
something similar, whether it's long-term Lyme or this long COVID that people are struggling with. It means you're waking up in the morning and feeling as exhausted as when you went to bed, and you're not sure from day to day whether you'll be able to simply get through the normal activities like making coffee or
Yes.
sweeping. I mean, just days when I could actually do housework were revelations to me. And this went on for almost 5 years. And there were times toward the end of that period when David and I talked about leaving the property. I could no longer do the many things that we had to do to maintain our lifestyle there. It required so much energy from cutting brush to chopping wood to planting, weeding, harvesting, putting up produce. And I would have days when I'd feel good and I'd say, no, I can stay, we can do this. But ultimately, we decided I couldn't. And we left that property in 2020,
Okay.
which was
So,
heartbreaking.
yes, yeah. Now but you didn't sell it, so you go back to visit it? Do I have that right?
No, we did
Oh,
sell
you did
it.
sell it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we wanted to make a clear cut. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So what did you use as a source of hope and resilience during the time you were suffering from Lyme's?
It was depressing, certainly, often, but I thought to myself, what can I do? Let's focus on what I'm capable of. Even
Good.
as I'm lying in bed here, I could write and I could read. Most of the time, I had energy to hold a pen and a book. So that's what I did.
Great.
And as I say in Slow Blues, which is the final essay in Shelter and Storm, I felt walled off from my life. But it was this reading and curiosity about what was going on outside that finally got me out. And the impetus was the discovery that a blue glowing firefly lived only in this slim region north of where we lived, and few entomologists even had ever seen it. And I thought, okay, that's my quest. That's going to get me out.
Great.
And it did. We drove up to this spot where they had been recorded in 1926 and their behavior had been recorded. Oftentimes, it's hard to know fireflies apart, the species, unless you look at them under a microscope. It's easier to recognize them by their behavior, their color of light, and their dipping or flying activity. And after a few tries, I did find the slow blue fireflies, and they're stunning. They glow this turquoise blue, and they dip and they soar. And when I found them with my friend Liz, we had been staring at the swamp for hours, and suddenly we turned around and they were behind us, probably that whole time. And it just seemed like a metaphor for life, right? You're fixated on this
Yes.
is where it has to be, this is where I expect it. And then when you relax and look around, it's like, oh, well, there they are. What a surprise and what a joy to see that, astonishment.
Well, the other beautiful part of that story, and I want people to read it because your friend is so wonderful, and you embody what we hope people will embrace for resilience. You have a mission, so you're able, which generally, when you're reading something or you're very busy trying to figure something out, you're more regulated because you now have a mission. You're not just thinking of what illness you have. And then you have connection with her and communication about this passion. And then you have the opportunity to record it. So it becomes, a part of what you pass on to someone else. That is, you still feel viable.
Hmm.
It's such a great example at the end of coping with long-term illness in a way that makes you feel like I'm on the playing board. I'm still here.
Hmm.
I just moved the king. Yes. So and I loved your friend's support of you.
Yeah, that's part of the resilience for me was depending on friends, knowing when it was okay to ask for help and to accept it, but also just having them nearby. I certainly recognized it when I was listening to the stories of those flood survivors.
Hmm.
I could see them becoming lighter as they told me their stories. And even though I was no therapist, I had no training, it seemed to work to help them out. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, what you're saying is what we find now. It is, one theorist says, it's not just the telling, it's there has to be someone who's told. There has to be a listener. People who have suffered horrific things need someone to hear it. It helps you hold it and bear witness to it. And that's what you did in that project. And that's, I think, what even happened with your fire fly friend. She knew how important this was for you, and it was probably amazing when you turned around and saw them.
It was, and it was great to share that with someone. And
Yes.
meanwhile, as the, I don't want to say regular fireflies, but all the fireflies we weren't focused on were flashing over the swamp. Above us, the planets were rising and falling, and the stars were streaking by, shooting stars. It was just a wonderful moment. I love the way you frame this, and point out the elements that contributed to the resilience, because I don't often do that myself. I
Okay,
appreciate that.
that's
Thanks.
good. The other thing that caught me with concern was your discussion of the contamination of well water. And so my question was, do you think there's been movement toward that? You say most people have turned to bottled water, but do you think there are people who are not aware that their well water is contaminated?
I'm sure there are many
Mm.
people, especially in rural areas, who are unaware that their well water is contaminated. One thing about contamination is that once you've been drinking that water for a while, in the case of bacteria, your body adjusts. So it might not be you who gets sick from the water. It might be a visitor, like grandma comes to visit and
Mm,
can't handle the bacteria load in your well water.
mm,
But we
mm,
know that the vast majority of well owners, in Wisconsin at least, never get them tested. I'm not sure why that is, whether they don't want to know, because what else are they going to do? That's the only water source you have in the country unless you build a rainwater cistern, which is very uncommon and not that cheap. Digging a well is less expensive.
mm,
The policies, at least in Wisconsin, whose economy rests on agriculture, are not favorable in general to well owners. They're favorable to agriculture. So all the pesticides, herbicides, and manure that are spread or sprayed on
right.
fields does filter into that groundwater and affect the wells. If people do test their wells, there are only a certain number of, possibilities for addressing that problem. And bottled water is one of them. In the most contaminated areas, that's what the state and neighbors have recommended. So it's definitely pointing to a need to change policies.
Mm.
We need to address these contaminants filtering into the aquifer.
Are they funded to get and use bottled water? I mean, we don't have high incomes in some of these areas.
In some cases where there's been a lawsuit, like in Kewaunee County, Wisconsin, where, it's known that certain dairy operations have poisoned the wells of neighbors, and they went to court and they took a long time, but part of the lawsuit provided for bottled water for these people. But, that's not a long-term solution, and
Mm,
it doesn't occur in most places. That's
mm,
not funding for bottled water is not usually available.
mm. Now, if David were in our conversation today, is there a particular topic or that he would have wanted us to talk about? And or if I had said to him, what's a moment you'll never forget? What do you think he would say?
Well, he and I founded a community radio station in the nearest city called Viroqua.
Okay.
He had a background in radio. I have a little background in radio, but he more than I. And he was passionate about starting local media. And we did. We spent years volunteering to create this station, WDRT
Okay.
91.9 FM. It's still going strong today, and it
Okay.
welcomes a multiplicity of voices. But he felt so passionate about local media that he was willing to devote years of his life, building the technology and the studios. And now he has turned his profession into supporting radio stations around the country with their technology. And he's
Wow.
just in the other room doing that now.
Oh, that's terrific. That is great.
Yeah.
That is really great. And if you would just, if I were to say to you, what's the most vivid take-home image that you have while you were living in the Driftless? I'm sure there's many, but I'll ask it for one poignant one.
It's so hard to pick one. Okay, I'll give you two.
Okay, good.
One is standing in our yard, looking up and seeing the huge dome of stars. We could see the Milky Way so clearly. And, just holding each other and looking up at the sky. That was wonderful. And the other one would be that celebration of resilience that we held for flood survivors who had told us their stories. People from diverse backgrounds were gathered in this organization, the visitor center of a nature preserve, and sharing their stories. And I just felt that collective hum of open heartedness. And I could tell that everyone in that room didn't want that evening to end.
I
It
bet.
was warm and affirming.
Yeah, it sounds magical. It really does. Tamara, I want to thank you for your courage, for the way you write, for putting these essays together into this precious book. I want our readers to know where they can buy this book and how they can contact you or your agent.
Yes, Shelter and Storm at Home in the Driftless is available to order from any of your favorite booksellers right now, and it'll be on bookstore shelves starting next Tuesday, the 22nd. It's
Okay.
also, if you want to learn more about it, you can go to shelterandstorm.com. And if you want to find me at a reading or a workshop that's upcoming, you can go to my website, which is Tamara Dean, TamaraDean.media. And the options right on the homepage will show you events or where to buy the book too.
So quickly, what's a workshop example?
Mm. Writing from a Changing Place. I'm
Okay.
offering a 3-hour seminar on Sunday, April 27th. It's called Bearing Witness, Writing from the Environment. And it also addresses the change and the grief associated with that we're witnessing in our environment. I love teaching, so that one's a fun one.
Perfect, perfect. I want to thank you again, and I want to thank our listeners. Remember, you can hear this and any prior show as a podcast on my host site, my website, and on the podcast app of your iPhone, on iTunes, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, all of the platforms. It will be up until it'll pretty much be up, and you can always reference the archives to find it as time goes on. Remember to drop me a comment or a question at suephil@optonline.net. Until next week, please be safe, enjoy nature. Thanks.